Hello. This is the last one of the presentations about mental imagery for the Brains blog, and you're going to be relieved to hear that you're going to get a break from looking at me pontificating. And I wanted to show you mainly pictures today, because today's topic is the role of mental imagery in aesthetics. So I started out talking about what I mean by mental imagery, or how we should think about mental imagery, and I talked about the role it plays in everyday perception, and then I talked about consequences for epistemology. Today I want to talk about consequences for aesthetics, and I want to say that they play a very important role in aesthetics. So I want to start from further away. I want to start with the concept of aesthetically relevant properties. So one question about aesthetics is this: when you're engaging with an artwork, sometimes shifting your attention is going to make an aesthetic difference. And I'm interested in this phenomenon. So you've been looking at this logo, which was the logo of the Brazil World Cup 2 years ago. It's a pretty ugly logo. It's supposed to, I think the shape is supposed to somehow represent the shape of the trophy. There's also the Brazilian national colors and the hands coming in together in harmony. But now look at this. Facepalm. We all know what facepalm is, and I'll try to look at the same logo again. Very difficult to not to see it differently. So again, there's an aesthetic difference to be made there. Here's a more artsy example. So that's an early abstract painting by Paul Klee. Nice. But here's the title, green X above left. And now try to look at this. And it's going to be, my prediction is that this part of the screen is going to be much more salient now than it was before. And it's also possible that before you read the title, the whole thing was somehow didn't have the kind of unity that it acquired when you looked at it for the second time. So shifting your attention to the green X made an aesthetic difference here, and a positive aesthetic difference. Now, not all aesthetic difference is positive. So you'll remember Goldfinger, the James Bond movie. So here's the villain, Goldfinger. When you saw this, you were probably not so sensitive to a certain similarity, namely to this. Uncanny, if you ask me. So I just watched this movie on the plane, and the similarity to Donald Trump really did make an aesthetic difference, and not a positive one. All right, so the idea is that there are certain properties that are such that if you attend to them, that makes an aesthetic difference. And I'm interested in these properties, and I call them aesthetically relevant properties, in sharp opposition with aesthetic properties, which play a huge role in aesthetics, like being beautiful, or being graceful, or being ugly. I think aesthetically relevant properties are in some ways much more important and much more interesting. But what I want to talk about today, and if you want to read about aesthetically relevant properties, then that's the book to read, I guess. But what I want to talk about today is the set of those cases when aesthetically relevant properties are represented in mental imagery. So many of the examples that I mentioned, like the green X, then the aesthetically relevant property was the green X, and the way it was represented is perceptually. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes the aesthetically relevant properties are represented non-perceptually. For example, in the case of the art, if you know the artist's intention or the social or art historical context. But what I want to talk about today is those examples when the aesthetically relevant properties are represented in mental imagery. There's going to be a bunch of those cases. So in this picture, there's just a lot of them. So first of all, you have to exercise your mental imagery in order to somehow amodally complete that dancer on the stage. Also to amodally complete the person under that top hat, or the rest of the face of the guy with the pipe who's turning away from you. And then, of course, the waitress is looking at you, and that also brings in mental imagery in some way. So before I get to the examples, I want to, if I manage to get this work, I want to talk about why this is interesting, or why this is important for aesthetics. And I want to highlight, and I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures, but I want to highlight two features that the kind of mental imagery that is being exercised here have. One of them is that very often it's top-down mental imagery. And the other one is that very often the properties, the aesthetically relevant properties that this mental imagery represents are determinable. They can be determinable, they can be determinate. Often they are determinate. It's just very clear how you should, let's say, complete certain missing information. But some other times it's left intentionally opaque or intentionally determinable what it is, what kind of mental imagery you have to complete. And we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the role of attention in mental imagery, but this is going to really pay off here. So some fairly prosaic examples first, and those are examples where where you have to exercise your mental imagery to complete something that is off screen. So Degas was big on this. That dancer on the right, there's we can see her face, we can see half of her body, we can't see much of. We basically can't see anything of the dancer here. Only the top of her head. And then Godard made a kind of a minor industry of composing pictures where the characters are very close to the edge of the frame, so that you have to use mental imagery to complete them. And there and here. And of course you can have some major fun with this idea as well. As in here, for example, which is an example that again highlights the importance of top-down influences there. So the way you're completing these boots is influenced by your previous exposures with how boots continue upwards, namely in soldiers. So these were kind of off-screen effects, but you also need a mental imagery sometimes inside the frame. So this is from Harvey, where the main character, Jimmy Stewart, hallucinates this 6 feet tall rabbit. And the way the images are composed is such that as if there were actually a 6 feet tall rabbit next to Jimmy Stewart here and here. So again, you need to use your mental imagery here a little bit, and that's going to be an aesthetically relevant feature of the film. But there are some less sophisticated or maybe less artistic examples, but again, in order to engage with this, you're going to need mental imagery. Here's an example I really like, and that's also important to highlight the determinacy or the kind of degrees of determinacy of the mental imagery that you use when you're engaging with visual art. So this is from Belle de Jour, and we never see what's in this box. We hear a certain kind of humming sound coming out of this. It's apparently fascinating, whatever is inside, but we just get no information about what it is. So this is actually a multimodal mental imagery that's being exercised, but it's also just extremely determinable whatever is going on there. We just don't know. You never know. It's left intentionally open. What's in there? Not so much determinable aesthetically relevant properties there. Okay, and you also get some nice, much more constrained exercise of mental imagery in cases like this. Occlusion is another major source of mental imagery, and we talked a lot about occlusion before, but it also plays a role in art sometimes. So can you spot the occluded bit here? So actually, that period of art history, painters were really trying very hard to avoid occlusion, and so sometimes they did play with it, like here, when you only see the nose and the chin. But you get occlusion in a more kind of aesthetically significant way. For example, here in La Clisse. So this is, some of my examples are highbrow, some of them are not so highbrow. So this is from Seinfeld, where one of the characters is a running gag of not showing his face. So you can see his shadow, you can see his hand, but the guy actually occluded. You can see him self-occluding himself, but you're never going to see his face. And a little bit of a visual gag going on there throughout the episodes. And then Godard again is doing a lot of self-occlusion when he's just, that's not the way a normal film should present its characters. That one of them is self-occluding its face, and the other one is occluded by the guy. That's just not the way films are supposed to be. So Godard obviously went out of his way to make it this way. I'm gonna skip these, and I'm gonna skip the gaze as well. Temporal mental imagery is also very important. So this is something that I didn't talk about a lot. I think I probably should have. It's a very interesting application of the whole idea of mental imagery. So the question is, when you have an experience, a perceptual experience, how are you going to represent the split second just before and the split second just after the present moment? And there's a long and very obscure history of this idea, revolving around the concept of species present. That's William James's concept, and he thought that somehow our experience is not the knife edge; it's more like a saddleback. So in some sense, it's not just the present moment that we're aware of; we're also aware of the moment that just passed or that's just coming up. And then the question is, of course, how are we going to represent those moments? And if you think of mental imagery the way I do, then it's the obvious answer would be to say that, well, by means of mental imagery. So it's a little bit like peripheral vision for space. So in the case of peripheral vision, when we're looking, that's not going to be represented by means of mental imagery. But then the further you go to the periphery, the more role mental imagery will play. And so the same temporally here. But in the case of the aesthetic engagement here, you can see that how the representation of the next moment that's just going to happen after after what is depicted here is going to be very aesthetically relevant in engaging with this picture. So Vermeer, I think, is really interesting because from this temporal mental imagery point of view, because one thing that is really special about his pictures, or some of his pictures, is that the temporal mental imagery just is going to latch onto the exact same thing that's going on here. So if you are somehow trying to imagine what's going to happen in the next moment and what happened in the last moment, you get the exact same picture. It's the same visual image. So that's something that gives this kind of tranquility to Vermeer's pictures. I'm going to skip that and go to conceptual art. So it's conceptual art where mental imagery is going to play a huge role. So this is Rauschenberg's erased Deconic drawing, where he asked for a drawing from de Koning, who's extremely famous by then, and he just erased it. So very difficult to engage with this without having some kind of mental imagery of what was there, what could have been there. And again, very determinable, very top down as well. Really nice example from Duchamp. So he made this little joke of painting mustaches and mustache and beard on the Mona Lisa. That's not really what I'm going to be interested in. What I'm going to be interested in is in a follow-up piece, which is really indistinguishable from a picture of the Mona Lisa, but its title is Mona Lisa Rasée, so the shaven Mona Lisa. So in order to see that picture, not as just a reproduction of Mona Lisa, but as Mona Lisa Rasée, you have to have some kind of mental imagery of the mustache that used to be there, or that was there in this previous work. And of course, that's going to be not only a top-down effect of mental imagery, but also just an extremely somehow intellectual top-down effect that has to somehow take art historical context into consideration. Here's another nice example of a Man Ray artwork where mental imagery plays a role. And there's certain artists who are just going out of their way to basically all of their work is what it turns on is aesthetically relevant properties represented in mental imagery. So Magritte is one of them, and let's just say a lesser artist, but Andres Serrano is another one. I'm gonna skip all this expectations and just gonna conclude that if it is true that mental imagery plays this really important role, and that mental in aesthetics in our engagement with aesthetic works of art, and if it's also true that that mental imagery is very often top-down and is dependent on cultural influences or cultural context, then our engagement with the works of art is going to be very much dependent on our culturally acquired knowledge. And then in order to understand how we engage with works of art, we have to take into consideration this kind of history of mental imagery. This is a very Wolfinesque thought, and I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. So thank you.